I met with K15T and let's talk about release notes. So if you work on a product team, your team is working hard to deliver new features and improvements to increase the value of your product. But how do you know that you're communicating those changes to users? How do you make sure that they are aware of the new functionality and updates and the difference they'll make in their lives? See, when users overlook new features or miss opportunities to introduce whole new use cases into their workflow, it's just kind of a huge loss for everyone. So of course we don't want this to happen, and there are lots of ways to communicate the value of your products, but a great one is by writing really good release notes. So in this video, we'll talk about some of the problems with neglected release notes and the consequences that your users and your team suffer. And then we'll look at some of the release notes for the products that myself and my team at K15T use every day to see what they're doing well, what could be improved, and what inspires you and your team to create great release notes that communicate the value of your product. So we really didn't want to use a real example of release notes to point out all the things you shouldn't do with your release notes, but let me just tell you, they are out there. So that means we all have a bit we can learn and improve. So here's an example that I've sort of conjured up, and right away we can see these are absolutely way too technical. We are absolutely going into the weeds on all the wrong things, and this isn't good for almost any audience. Even if you're creating release notes for a technical audience like engineers, part of the release notes is to summarize and communicate value. And just going into the weeds and being absolutely too technical in the wrong areas is going to turn people off from reading these in the first place. You'll also notice these are not accessible. They're not formatted well. It's really hard to skim through and understand which things actually matter to me. And part of this is also because they're just straight up poorly designed. They're not laid out well. It's hard to know which things should I care about, which things are bug fixes. It's just sort of a mess of text. And then finally, while in some places they're way too technical, in other areas they're not detailed enough. And what's really missing here are details around value and use cases. What do these things actually mean to me? I have about 30 seconds to skim through these. If you're not catching me with a value statement, I've got work to do. So this is an extreme example of basically all the wrong things that you could do with your release notes. Let's look at some real examples to give some inspiration on what things people are doing really well and maybe what things your team wants to improve on to make sure your release notes are great. And speaking of great, we wanted to focus on release notes for products that our team actually uses, ones that we think are great, who make release notes that we think are great. So first up is 1Password. Although 1Password is a simple looking password manager, we absolutely love the communication that comes from this company. These release notes are super stellar, starting with great introductions. Each major change has a great intro here, so you can clearly see sort of what has happened and why that matters. And over here on the side, you can actually filter for the platform that you're using. So you can see release notes specific to the apps running on that platform, which is so cool when you're managing a bunch of different variants to make it easy for users to say, oh yeah, I use Mac and an Android phone. What's new for me? Another thing that's really cool here is they explain each change, including an image. And I think the images are so cool, especially when they use animated ones, so you can really clearly see sort of like what has happened. Super neat. Now, no release notes are perfect. So let's talk about some things that I think could be improved here. One of those is that while they're simply explaining some improvements here, they don't have a lot of details. So if I'm an advanced user or maybe a security researcher who cares a lot about password security, I may be disappointed by what I'm seeing here. One of the other missing things is a link to the documentation to learn more. That would be a great way for me to jump in and get those details, but there really just isn't that link that I'm looking for. Also, while there are some headings in place here, I can't navigate them quickly. I have to skim through all the release notes myself. What I would really love to see is a table of contents or something that I could quickly click through to get through things. But overall, good on you, 1Password. Great product. Great release notes. Thank you so much for connecting that value stream for those of us who love using your app. Now, let's jump over and look at the release notes for Slack. Now, Slack is pretty well known in the release notes game, but we are users of Slack ourselves, so of course we had to check them out for ourselves. And frankly, they're just great. They're really good at having nice overviews of what the release includes, even if it's a small release, which as a user who likes to look at every release note, I appreciate that. I want to know the tiny little things that I'm getting or the things that have been fixed, because sometimes those make the big difference. Also, it's nice to be able, again, to filter by the deployment, so I can say, hey, I'm a user on Windows. I don't want to see what's going on with the Mac client, for example. I also love the writing style here. So there's a fine line you have to draw when you're creating release notes, so you're not just making jokes and puns, especially if you have an international audience. Instead, Slack keeps things light and fun and has some plays on words that are just so fun to read. And then, of course, there are a couple of little jokes, but they're not missing out on any of the truly important information here. They're just adding a bit to it rather than kind of obscuring it or making it hard to understand. So like, really well done, Slack. This is a hard way to write, but it's absolutely worth it, because even when I'm downloading iOS release updates, which most of the time I don't read those notes, I love checking out the ones from Slack because sometimes they're just so much fun. And I can feel that value being added to my device with every release. Super cool. One of the things that's missing here is images. I feel like I've gone back in time. I'm looking at early 2000s release notes. There's just no way to see the changes that have been made. And with a product like Slack, which is a very visual product, I really want to know what are those changes, or even what are the bugs that have been fixed in some cases. Also, there's no links here to the documentation. So if I'm reading about how a feature has been improved, I might want to learn about that whole feature along with the improvement. And there's just no way, no easy way anyway, to get over to that documentation to actually read about it. But overall, really well done, Slack. Such a pleasure to read. And thank you so much for making release notes fun. Speaking of fun, let's jump over and look at the release notes for Unreal Engine. Now, Unreal Engine is a little bit different than the last two products that we've looked at in that it is so massively huge. I used to play Unreal Tournament as a kid. It was a lot of fun. It's amazing to see how this game engine has become this massive creative tool. And of course, the release notes have grown and changed to follow that. These release notes are like the newspaper of everything that creatives want to see. And so they're really, really robust. Now, one of my teammates, Stefan, is so in love with these release notes that he even said, quote, "They are the best he has ever seen." Oh no, he used the word perfect. Perfect release notes? Let's see. One of the things that's great right off the bat is there is an explanation of what the release includes, which is just perfect. I can read in like a sentence or two what this includes as a really, really big summation. I get it, it's not all the details, but I want to know, do I care about this? Should I continue to read? This also has a really great focus as you read on from the user's perspective, from the creatives that use Unreal Engine. They can see not just what's changed, but what is valuable to them. What is new that is going to change the way they work. I just love it. So good. Also, Unreal is a visual tool, right? It's literally an engine for creating graphics. And so it's great to see a lot of images and animations here to enhance what you're reading, to understand visually what are you now able to create. I think they've also struck a really good balance here of not having too many details, right? Because you could go totally into the weeds, but instead they're using links to the documentation so people can link off and go learn more about that new thing that they're totally interested in. Love that. And of course, these pages are just very easy to scan because they're using headings and great structure. I can clearly see the part of the engine that is valuable to me and my role and read more that I'm interested in. And finally, just in general, this is written more like a blog post than just a change log, which is perfect for the audience. Some programs you really don't want to go into that kind of detail, but this is exactly what the users of Unreal Engine want to see. One of the minor critiques that I would make here is there's no real like table of contents here, or at least it's not highlighting all the major categories. So it would be nice to be able to navigate through this because it's such a big piece of content that way. But you know, Unreal team, you're doing a really great job. Thank you so much for sharing all of the value that you're driving into your product. Another app used by the creatives at K15T are apps in the Adobe suite. So Illustrator, Photoshop, Premiere. We use these apps all the time in creating a lot of the great things that our users see every day. And one of the things that we love about Adobe's release notes is that they are baked into their product. So I don't have to go out in my browser to read them, although I can. They're actually brought right into whatever Adobe app you're using, and it's a really nice experience. Of course, as you would expect from Adobe, they are really well designed with a nice use of imagery and graphics to illustrate what you can do with the new features. And for those improvements where they are larger than the 1 or 2 sentences they use to summarize, you can click to learn more. And again, that opens up the product documentation, but in a side window, which is great. So I'm right there, I'm looking at the app that I want to use, and I can use the documentation to explore that new improvement, which is, love it. If I could give Adobe a critique, it's that these are in my way. Anytime the Adobe app that I want to use is updated, I jump in to do something really quick because I'm using Premiere to edit a video, and then there's release notes in my face. I need those out of there so that I can get back into my timeline and continue editing. It's not that I don't want to see what's new, it's just I don't want to see it right now. Now is not the time. So there needs to be a way that I can click a button to say, hey, email these to me, or notify me at the end of my workday, or something like that. If you have any ideas on how this could be done well, or any places where you've seen this done well, please drop those in the comments below, because we have seen nothing but trouble, but also we love the idea of bringing release notes right into your product. So we'd love to know, how do you think that could be done better? Because we're still trying to figure that out ourselves. Another great app that we use internally at K15T is OBS Studio, which is really interesting because it is an open piece of software, which means it's created by the community. So the release notes and the documentation are completely written by those community of people that are contributing to and improving the software. That said, historically, open source software does not have great documentation or release notes, because when volunteers are looking at giving time, they're like, okay, do I spend an hour improving the code, or do I spend an hour writing about the code that someone else improved? Generally, people focus on the code improvements versus the documentation. So the release notes here are not necessarily exemplary, but they're doing some things really, really well. So some positives here are that these are very detailed. So as a power user of OBS, I can look through here and say, perfect, that little change or improvement that I needed has been implemented. That's going to improve my workflow. Huzzah. Also, I think the bug fixes are really well explained here. I think sometimes it's easier to fix the bug than to write about the fix that you implemented. So really nice job here, community. It's obvious to me what has been fixed, and that will just make my life as a user better. Now, speaking of better, there are some things with these release notes that definitely can be improved. One is just around accessibility. Because OBS is a community project, it's sort of all over the place, right? There's stuff in GitHub, there's stuff on the OBS community, there's stuff that YouTubers have made, and release notes are kind of all over the place. It's hard to know as a user where to go to find release notes on different things. Luckily, they are here on the GitHub, but a lot of users of OBS aren't even interested in those, right? They just want to go on the OBS community and read blogs on like what's new with OBS. So that could be improved. Also, there's no great introduction. It's hard to know like what are the major themes of this release, especially with the new features. What are the things that the community is focusing on? There is no headings or grouping, so I don't know what are the big chunks here, or what are the features that are only for Mac users, for example. These would be really valuable details to see, and instead we just have a really, really big bulleted list. So often I rely on people on YouTube who have already gone through and summarized all those things into major themes for me. But overall, OBS Studio is a great example of an open source piece of software that is doing a lot of things right. And as a user, I am so appreciative of all the value that I continue to get, and these release notes help me understand what that value is. Okay, so let's wrap this video up with a list of reasons why you should have good release notes. I think I've touched on a lot of them, but here's the list, the reason why you should make sure your release notes rock. First of all, it helps users discover changes that have been made, bugs that have been fixed, and this reduces the number of support tickets and the support workload, which is a huge money saver within the company, and it helps support focus on real issues and not just communicating changes. Your release notes should be doing that. Your release notes help users understand what is happening when. So they don't have to say, where is that new feature? I thought that was coming out. Or are they working on this new feature? No one in support should have to answer that. Product managers shouldn't have to answer that. It should just be in the release notes so everybody can see it. Release notes are an amazing place for folks like marketing and communications individuals to say, okay, here's what's going to be in the release. Here's how we're going to make sure that everyone in the market understands what new value we're putting out there. Release notes are the place for them to begin. And then finally, release notes are your opportunity to communicate the value of your product. Release notes are taking all the work that your team has done and then wrapping it in what your users actually need. You had your users in mind when you started making the thing, but the release notes are your opportunity to write directly to those users in a way that they care about to show that you are driving new value streams into their lives so they can do more with your product. So yeah, having great release notes really matters. As users of products ourselves and builders of products, we at K15T are super passionate about release notes because we think they're such an important touch point in communicating that value that we really want to get as users and give as creators of products. Now, if you'd like to dig in more, check out the links in the description to find a checklist you can use to make sure you don't miss anything in your next release notes, a link to our blog where you can learn more, and a link to subscribe to our monthly newsletter where we dive into all sorts of topics like the hidden life of product information and in-app documentation, and where we continue to explore using things like release notes to share what you do best.